for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to pursue a question that I initially asked in question period on February 23rd. And unfortunately, in the course of assessing my question, and because the response was given by the Minister of Environment, my question was rather mischaracterized because I was speaking directly to the Minister of Public Safety about some disturbing language used in an RCMP report related to environmental protests and First Nations objections to fossil fuel developments. The report, you may recall, Mr. Speaker, was given some prominence in the Globe and Mail on February 17th. It was originally authored and dated January 24th, 2014, so that more than a year before the question that I put to the Minister, there was a report and assessment by the RCMP of what the RCMP labeled, quote unquote, an anti-petroleum movement. The report, as obtained by Greenpeace and published in segments in the Globe and Mail, said, quote, there is growing, highly organized and well-financed anti-Canada petroleum movement that consists of peaceful activists, militants, and violent extremists who are opposed to society's reliance on fossil fuels, unquote. Now, what I raised with the Minister was that just recently President Barack Obama had pointed out that the climate crisis is a much bigger threat to security than terrorism, and that it's important to understand security threats for what they are, and ignoring the climate crisis is to put this nation, its economy, and its citizens at risk. The question that I put forward was that would the Minister for Public Safety undertake scientific briefings so the RCMP would actually understand the nature of the climate crisis, because the Globe and Mail reports, with direct quotes from the RCMP, said the following, that the RCMP report used language like environmentalists, quote unquote, claim that climate change is the most serious global threat, and, quote unquote, claim it is a direct consequence of human activity and is, quote unquote, reportedly linked to the use of fossil fuels. Now, the language that concerns me and the overall context that concerns me is that here we have the RCMP conducting surveillance of some kind, I suppose, on the climate change movement, and in assessing its objections to fossil fuels, mischaracterizes the nature of the understanding of the threat by those who are active in opposing fossil fuel developments as having merely claims and reliance on reports, whereas those who object to the expansion of the fossil fuel industry are basing their concerns on science. And if the RCMP wanted to investigate language of those who are opposed to fossil fuel developments, they might find it includes the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the International Energy Agency. It's the International Energy Agency that has said that of all known reserves of fossil fuels, 2/3 of all known reserves must remain in the ground till at least 2050, or we put human civilization at risk. It's the RCMP who need a science backgrounder in climate and perhaps direct their attention to those things that are real threats to Canadian security, rather than monitoring the legal activities of Canadians who oppose expansion of fossil fuel developments in the interest of protecting our children. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased to rise today to address the concerns of the member of Saanich Gulf Islands. Let me first be very clear on this and highlight a fact that I believe that the member often forgets, and that is the importance of the global fight against terrorism all around the world, not just here in Canada. And the fact that the member seems to forget that the international jihadi movement has declared war on Canada, actually naming Canada as one of the countries for terrorists to take attacks on against Canadian citizens and on this soil. We are actually being targeted by the jihadi terrorists simply because of the values that we have in this country and the fact that these terrorists hate the society in which Canada is a very open and tolerant society. That is why, Mr. Speaker, our government has put forward measures to protect Canadians against terrorists who seek to destroy the very principles that make Canada the best country in the world to live. Mr. Speaker, I also want to be clear that there is no liberty without security, and without strong security, there would be no prosperity, not for anyone here in Canada. That is why we're making sure that our policing agencies have the tools they need to keep us safe, both financially by providing them the resources as well as legislative tools. Our government, in fact, has already increased the resources available to police forces by 1/3. Interesting enough, but not surprising, the Liberals and NDP voted against both of these, actually 7 times, increases at each step of the way that we've tried to enhance resources for those types of agencies. And now again in Budget 25, we further increase resources for the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the Canada Border Services Agency by almost $300 million to bolster our frontline efforts to counter terrorism. I hope that the opposition parties will support our budget and those measures, but I'm probably holding my breath. Our government will continue to ensure that our police forces have the resources they need to keep Canadians safe. Now, Mr. Speaker, the member opposite has brought up the issue of climate change. Was not happy with the answer that she had received from the Minister of the Environment. So let me just reiterate a part of the answer. Our Conservative government is actually the first government in Canadian history to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we will continue to do so without a job-killing carbon tax. And I think that's important for Canadians to know. Also, what's important, Mr. Speaker, Canadians should know that it is on this side of the House that we will continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with our allies around the world fighting the global threat of terrorism. And we will continue to fight specifically against the death cult known as the Islamic State. And I want to remind the members in this House and the member opposite that the Director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service has actually said that the Islamic State and terrorism is the biggest threat to our national security. So Canadians know that they can count on this side of the House, the Conservative government, to keep Canadians safe.
You sure can.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't think you've ever heard an adjournment proceedings that constituted so much of a mismatch of the question asked by an opposition member and the response from the parliamentary secretary. But let's just point out that this is the government that has cut emergency preparedness for the environment on all our coasts, cut preparedness for earthquakes, not prepared for the climate crisis, and also cut back in natural disaster preparedness. So I don't think they can make the claim they keep us safe, but I must reject, and I am surprised to find the honourable member for the parliamentary secretary raising the attack against me that I'm not aware of jihadi terrorism. In the context of the debate on C-51, I made it very clear we are concerned, the Green Party is concerned, and that's why we opposed C-51, continue to oppose it, because experts in security have been clear C-51 will make us less safe by creating CSIS without any oversight, giving it disruptive powers, and very likely, as many security experts said, making us more vulnerable to terrorist attack, while again ignoring the climate crisis.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, there's a lot of misinformation coming from the opposition benches, including the member from Saanich Gulf Island. In fact, and she should know this, and I'm not sure why she's misleading the House, but in her hometown, her home province of British Columbia, we've actually increased Coast Guard funding by 27%. So what we just heard is simply not the case. But again, when we get back to the issue of direct issues of terrorism and public safety and standing up for Canadians, I want to be very clear, again going back to what the director of CSIS said in his very public report. It was open for everyone to see. He said that the jihadi terrorism is the single most... There
are really no points of order in adjournment proceedings.
I'm just surprised to hear the honourable member make an accusation misleading
No.
the House. That's one thing that rise to the point of privilege, does not.
Yeah, well, just on that point, you know, unless the reference is made to deliberately misleading, where there's some imputing of motive normally those characterizations are not considered unparliamentary. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I said in the public report, the director of CSIS actually said jihadi terrorism is the single most serious threat to Canada's national security. But I believe that the member, deep down, probably already knows this, but either chooses to ignore it or simply refuses to accept it. However, while I'm on my feet, Mr. Speaker, I would like to take this opportunity to ask the member from Saanich Gulf Island to do the right thing. Not too long ago, in fact, very recently, that member made ridiculous comments about admitted terrorist Omar Ahmed Khadr. This is a person who pled guilty to heinous crimes, Mr. Speaker, including the murder of American Army medic Sergeant Christopher Spear. Our Conservative government has vigorously defended against any attempt to lessen his punishment for these crimes. And while the Liberal leader refused to rule out special compensation for the terrorist and the NDP actively tries to force Canadian taxpayers to compensate him, we believe on this side of the House that it is the victims of crime and not the perpetrators are the ones to deserve compensation. So I would ask the member from Saanich Gulf Islands to apologize to the wife of Tabitha Spears, who was left without a husband, and to the children of Army medic.
Yeah, we're well over our the 1 minute permitted.